When you play the Game of Thrones, you
subscribe and like,
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Comics YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to be ranking all of the POVs from a Game of Thrones. Now, I mean the first book. I don't mean the whole series, just a Game of Thrones. And as you guys know, I have been doing a deep dive and reread of a Game of Thrones. It's taken me about a year and 7 months to get through the entire book, page by page on YouTube. And this whole time, I've kind of been hinting at it to you guys. I've been rating all the chapters, putting them in order, and giving them a rating like out of 10. And so today we're going to briefly talk about the POVs, why I believe some are really good, and some are not bad, but they're maybe not as good as others. And so that is going to be the discussion point of today's video. Before we get into it, I wanted to say a massive thank you to my Patreons and members for supporting me on this channel. If you did want to become one, you do get videos early, and you do get exclusive videos, House of the Dragon during that season, and then other stuff when it's not House of the Dragon season. So I hope you guys all enjoy, and let's get into it. So with the POVs of a Game of Thrones, I think a Game of Thrones, out of all 5 books, has the most consistent quality of any of them. And what do I mean by that? I mean, there's not a lot of chapters that I look at in this book and I go, that really wasn't a great chapter, right? All of them have at least like an 8 out of 10 rating where they're good, but maybe not great, right? They don't outshine others. And that's what kind of made rating all the chapters in this book so difficult to do, because there is no like great split. And A Feast for Crows is kind of similar to a Game of Thrones because it's kind of a consistent quality in terms of the entire book. But I think A Feast for Crows, why I don't like it as much as a Game of Thrones, is I think a Game of Thrones highs are much higher than A Feast for Crows. But enough of that talk. Let's get into my ranking of the POVs. I am not ranking Will, by the way, just because he's one chapter. It doesn't really feel fair to throw him up here. But I'm just ranking the 8 that actually have more than one chapter. So let's start off with number 8. I feel like this really is not a surprise if you have listened to me on this channel enough or have been like watching the rereads, but number 8 is Bran. He comes in with an 8.57 rating out of 10. So even number 8, my least favorite POV of the book, pretty like highly rated, right? If I was doing something like a Dance with Dragons, that'd probably be more like in the middle than the bottom. But for me, I just think that Bran is not a great POV until the second half of the book. His first 3 POVs to me are pretty and what do I mean by that? I mean, Bran really doesn't develop as a character until the 4th chapter. Like, for me personally, when I look at the character, all you know about Bran is he likes to climb and he wants to be a knight. That's it. Like, that's his whole personality for the first half of this book, more or less. Like, I'd say the first 3 chapters, really. We don't get any other development outside of that. And yes, interesting plot things happen around Bran, for instance. Like, you know, he's our first inclination that, oh, Cersei and Jaime are sleeping together. Or the discovering of the direwolves in the first chapter. I am personally not a big fan of his 3rd chapter because it doesn't fit this book that well in terms of how everything else is going. Bran 3 feels like this out of nowhere. And I think part of it's because it's so early on in the book where we haven't explored a lot of the magic, and then you just get overloaded with a chapter that's completely magical. It feels very out of place. So I don't particularly love Bran 3. I think people really like it, or you really don't like it that much. And for me, that plotline hasn't really, even in the entire series, kind of been developed enough to where we know kind of what that sequence means for me to really put it very high. I think what saves Bran is that I think his later half, his relationship with Robb, is really great. And then even him, you know, having to become the Lord of Winterfell towards the later stages, and the kind of discussions about magic with Maester Luwin as, you know, him and also Rickon have this dream about Ned's death and him being in the crypts. I think he really gets going later on, but I don't think he ever hits the heights of like the major POVs in this book. And he also, mixed with that, he also starts out pretty slow. So to me, Bran is the clear worst POV of this book. But I don't say that meaning like he is a bad POV. I did find a number of his POV chapters actually very enjoyable, but somebody has to be last, and that is Bran in this book. Number 7, the only other character that is rated below a 9 out of 10 is Sansa. Sansa has an 8.92 rating out of 10 for me because she's just, I don't know how to say this without it sounding bad, but she's kind of just a mid POV. Like, all of her chapters seem to be of like a certain quality, right? They're not bad chapters, but none of them really go up and beyond. And so she's different in terms of Bran because Sansa doesn't have any like chapters where I look at that and I'm like, yeah, that was a really bad chapter, or not a bad chapter, but maybe a weak chapter of the book. None of those kind of stick out for Sansa. She has a lot of chapters. If you look at my rating when I do the chapters, probably in the coming weeks or maybe next week, a lot of her chapters are kind of ranked around the middle. And that's kind of how I feel about Sansa. She just has a lot of middle chapters where it's like her as a POV, as a character, this is not her book, right? She doesn't develop the most in this book. Like, yes, she starts out as a character that's completely naive, that believes in all these fairy tales, and that arc really is not like a one book arc. Whereas like other arcs in this book are one arc. So Jon is kind of a one arc character in this book. Dany has one arc that she really goes through. And so they feel more compelling the way they end, even like Arya as well, and Catelyn and Ned. Whereas Sansa doesn't have that feeling. Her arc isn't really going to be concluded until like Storm of Swords, when she leaves King's Landing. Her arc takes over multiple books. And so that does kind of hurt her in this book because she doesn't really have a resolution as much as the other characters do in this book. I think actually out of all the characters, she has the weakest conclusion just based upon the fact that it doesn't really resolve any issue or thing that's been building for Sansa, right? It's more like Sansa ends on this point where she realizes what she has to be. You know, she's grieving for Ned and all these things, and she's lashing out on Joffrey, and she realizes how that's not going to work. And so it's more like George is establishing where Sansa's going to go in the next book. It doesn't feel like it's concluded her arc from this book at all. And again, you'd say, well, she's not believing in all these fairy tales and stuff, but she still is, right? In book 2, she's still with Dantos, believing those things. So again, I think the major takeaway for why Sansa is this low is just the fact that she is a pretty okay POV in this book. She's not an outstanding POV, but she's also not bad at any point. She's just kind of in the middle. And she's really not able to shine because of Ned and Arya and King's Landing. And even in the beginning of the story where she starts, she doesn't start until the Trident, so she actually has a very late start as well. She's just the POV of she's kind of the POV of all of the 8 to me that feels like they didn't get the attention they needed to develop as much as kind of the others did, which is weird given the fact that she has more POVs than Arya. It just feels like Arya is more focused on than Sansa. That's kind of the way I will kind of say it, I guess. Number 6 is Jon. And you guys might be surprised Jon being this low, but Jon is rated a 9.04 at number 6. That tells you enough about a Game of Thrones quality. I have 6 of the 8 POVs rated a 9 out of 10 or higher. And I kind of want to talk about Jon and Tyrion here at the same time because they're rated about the same. Number 5 being Tyrion with a 9.06. So again, they're really very close. And I actually think it's interesting because I think they both are very similar in the way I judged them. I think both of these characters are not bad to start off, but they're definitely like the less interesting POVs of like the first half of the book. Like Tyrion is a weird one because in my opinion, his early chapters are almost completely towards building other characters. So for instance, on Tyrion, right? Like his first couple chapters, you have the first chapter being kind of a building up of all the Lannisters, right? So you're seeing, for instance, Joffrey through his POV, the Hound. You're seeing Cersei and Jaime and Tom and Myrcella. It's a very short chapter. It's a lot about their family dynamic. And then going forward, it's a lot about building up Jon. And then after he leaves the wall, it's kind of about, okay, you kind of have the starting of his character as they're making their way to the Vale. And when they get to the Vale, it's kind of when we really see Tyrion. But the problem with Tyrion is I think you don't really see him develop as a character. Like the story in his chapters are not focused on him as a character until after they leave the Eyrie. Like his first chapter with Bran as they're getting the mountain clans on their side and he's telling about the story of Tysha. That's when the character of Tyrion really gets going. And so I think very similar to like Bran, for instance, he's a character that starts kind of slow but really gets going later on, and he hits way higher peaks than Bran. And also his chapters at the beginning are kind of better than Bran's. So it's just kind of like a better version of Bran in a sense. And Tyrion's just more interesting as a POV than Bran is himself. And Jon, why I have Jon a little bit lower than Tyrion is I think, one, Tyrion's more of an interesting read in terms of just the way Tyrion thinks about things and his dialogue and things like that. Jon is someone that really hits his stride, and I'd say the last 3 to 4 chapters of the book. Really when you get a bunch of things happening, like Maester Aemon's reveal and his speech about, love and being the death of honor and duty and all that stuff. And, the assassination attempt on Jorah Mormont and him, leaving the wall and maybe not coming back, but he's brought back by his friends. And Jon having this resolution where he realizes that he has to be a man of the Night's Watch. He can't help his family. And so he has a compelling end to his story as well. And I think all the characters in Game of Thrones do outside of like Sansa. I think hers is the weakest. Not bad by any means, but feels a little underwhelming for the character in comparison to how all the rest of these characters feel like they're perfectly concluded in this first book. But Jon, to me, it just takes him a little bit longer to get going than Tyrion, for instance. And also the idea that Tyrion is a much more, I think, developed POV, and that's just because he's an adult character, where Tyrion knows what he is already, so you don't have to take as much time building up Jon and what's his identity, who is he going forward. And so Jon is a notch lower than Tyrion, but they're very equivalent to me. I think it doesn't really matter where you rate them in terms of as long as they're together, because I think they're very similar. Now, number 4. Number 4 is a very difficult one for me to rate because Arya, to me, is really held up because of her last chapter. Because in a lot of ways, Arya, if you look at most of the book, she only has 5 chapters, right? I would say Tyrion and Jon, if you looked at consistency-wise, they're more consistent than Arya is. But Arya has like a top 5 chapter of the book because she has, Ned's death, right? I have Arya's last chapter ranked as my 3rd favorite chapter of this book. So that kind of tells you, right? She definitely gets carried because of her last chapter, because it's a culmination of everything she's learned, right? Her survivability skills, being able to survive in King's Landing, not falling for traps that have been laid for her, like the guys at the boat dressed up as Stark men, how she's even been able to survive in King's Landing, all this culminating in this moment that, Ned dying, right? It's this roller coaster of emotions because it's been built up to by Ned and Sansa's POVs, and now Arya gets the resolution, and it's the end of a beloved character. So I think that chapter really helps Arya, because I think her first chapter is actually one of the weakest of the book. And you might be thinking, well, whoa, I mean, it's, it's Arya 1, like, you got to build up a lot of stuff, and that's true, but there just isn't much that happens in that first chapter for her. It's her, taking lessons with Sansa, trying to knit and, make stuff and be ladylike, and she's not very good at that. And it just shows basically the differences between her and Sansa. And then also it's a good chapter to kind of introduce her and Jon, and also seeing like Robb and Joffrey's potential rivalry and all where all that's going. But outside of that, right, because she has 2 polar opposite ends, right, where she has one of the best chapters and one of my least favorite chapters of the book. And again, when I say least favorite chapters, I still like the chapters. It's just somebody's got to be the least favorite in a Game of Thrones, right? I love a lot, pretty much all the chapters I covered. It's just there's a couple outliers where I'm like, yeah, they got to be at the bottom, where they have to be at the bottom. And Arya, to me, she has the fewest POVs, which holds her down because, for instance, having one of those lower rated chapters is going to bring you down a little bit in your rating. And I do think she has some compelling chapters in terms of, seeing the Illyrio and Varys plot line where they're kind of talking about the events. They're kind of, underneath the castle, and Arya going through these passageways of Maegor the Cruels and all that. And that's really awesome and building up a lot of suspense. Her feeling guilty after what happens at the Trident, because we don't see her until they actually get to King's Landing and through a POV until after her first one. So she has her first one at Winterfell. She's not a POV for any of the journey to King's Landing, and then she is kind of a POV in King's Landing. And then just her dynamic with Syrio Forel, even her 4th chapter is really amazing, showing that she's learned all these skills from Syrio, trying to, sneakily get out of the castle and, live more or less in her eyes. So I think she's pretty good. Now, I think for me personally, you could basically switch up any of 4 through 8. I don't really feel like it's that much of a difference between all of them outside of maybe Bran. I think Bran to me is the far be it the worst POV of the book, but I think that, you could rank Arya, Tyrion, Jon, and Sansa in almost any order, and I wouldn't have too many arguments with you. But I think the top 3 are the top 3 of the book. I don't think any 3 of these POVs should be outside of the top 3. They are, to me, the dominant 3 of the book that are by far way ahead of the others. But let's start off. So Catelyn came in at and Arya, by the way, I did want to point out for Arya, before we move on, I did give her a 9.2 out of 10, just so you can kind of see the ratings of the chapters. She was a 9.2, so quite a big difference away from Tyrion at a 9.06, but I just did want to point that out before we moved on. But number 3 is Catelyn, and she has a 9.43 rating out of 10, so yeah, a significant jump up from Arya. And she's not very far behind Dany and Ned as well. So it's very close. Again, I think the top 3 you can order in almost any order, and I don't really have any complaints. But Catelyn, let's talk about the character of Catelyn. To me, Catelyn is one of those great characters because they're so human, right? We get so much of her dealing with the issues of this conflict that's led to her son, being almost assassinated. Her husband, who's been arrested and then dies in the Capitol, all the stresses she's going under. She's at a constant state of emotion versus logic, and so that makes her a very human character, probably the most human character of the book. So Catelyn is a really intriguing character because, of the characters, we have like an even split almost, where you have like 3 characters that are adults and you have 5 that are kids. So not an even split, but, kind of close. And Catelyn feels a lot like that, a lot with Ned as well, as I'll talk about when we get to Ned. But Catelyn, to me, you look at the chapters that get her up here. She has the King of the North chapter, one of my favorite chapters of the book, top 5. She has Tyrion's abduction chapter, which is another great chapter. She has Tyrion's trial by combat. Catelyn falls into this point where not only is she a very interesting character like, say, Tyrion, but she also gets all of the best moments of her plotline, right? Because she gets all of Robb's plotline that we see after he leaves Winterfell. She gets the resolution of Tyrion. She gets the journey to the Eyrie. She gets the stuff at the Twins, which is fantastic. I just think, to me, Catelyn is the perfect blend of, she has a lot of big plot points and also at the same time is a very intriguing POV. And I know a lot of people don't like Catelyn, and that really doesn't factor into the way I try to rank this POV, because I at times don't like Catelyn either, but I also can recognize that she has some of the best moments of the book and is one of the most well-developed characters of the book. Now, number 2 and number 1 actually have the same rating. So I actually could have gone either way. I just decided to go one way or the other because I felt like one of them deserved it more than the other. But let me continue on. So number 2 is Daenerys. So Daenerys, to me, she comes in at a 9.47 rating out of 10. So yeah, barely above Catelyn, but she is tied with Ned in terms of how I rated all of her chapters and Ned chapters. I think this is the biggest surprise to me. I knew that Dany was, good in this first book. I thought, more comparable to like Tyrion and Jon good. But I reread these chapters, and I won't lie. Daenerys is the POV I look to the most. And a lot of that is because, you get a lot of Ned in this book. So you almost feel overwhelmed by how much Ned you get. It feels like every other chapter is a Ned chapter. And Daenerys is kind of a break from the Westeros politics. And so you would think, okay, that's going to make Daenerys feel disconnected from the story. It's going to make her feel not as interesting because she's not involved in the main story. And I think some of that is true for her, especially in the next, couple books, because she is very disconnected from the actual main story. But not so in this book. She is very much connected to the normal story. Things that happen in Westeros impact her in Essos. And so I want to talk about Daenerys because I think of all of the children characters, the characters that are looking for identity, that are going through and becoming, an adult much quicker than they need to, I think Daenerys is the most developed and well-written character of the 5. I think her character is very similar to Jon in terms of the structure, but in that regard, Daenerys, to me, is more compelling to read. right off the get-go, her dynamic with Viserys is one of my favorite elements of this book. Not only because I think Viserys himself is an interesting character, an interesting character to study, it's interesting to see the dynamic between the two. As Daenerys, every single chapter starts to come more and more into her own. In the first chapter, she's this timid, nervous girl that's being abused by her brother and all this stuff. The second chapter, she's having to marry this Dothraki warlord, and she's powerless to do anything about this as she's sold into the Dothraki. The third chapter, she seems to gain more of that confidence as she, has been with the Dothraki for a long time. She's growing stronger and stronger and stronger. And we see that relationship with her and Viserys start to break down, whether it's, Viserys trying to basically tell her why is she commanding him, and him getting basically whipped and all that stuff. And it just is a interesting moment because you look at it and it's Daenerys, coming into herself and Viserys' downfall. Each chapter foreshadows it more and more until you get to the middle point of the book where it's, Viserys dying and Dany 5, one of my other favorite chapters of the book. And so you would think, okay, well, the most interesting part about Daenerys' arc is over, right? You would say, okay, her versus Viserys is kind of the interesting part of the first half for her. It's what really is interesting. And it's because another part of it is like we're learning the Robert's Rebellion stuff and all that through Ned and all the stuff going on in Westeros. We're getting the opposite of that with Daenerys, which is all very fascinating. But even after Daenerys 5, and I will admit, right, Daenerys does take, I'd say, a little bit of a down bit. I think her worst chapters are kind of right after Viserys' death. But it builds up to the next arc where you see Daenerys, now that she's in her own arc, she's trying to get, Drogo to go to Westeros to invade. It's all building up to this moment. But also she connects to Westeros because Robert's trying to assassinate her, and it connects into that beautifully because that also had ripple effects on Ned and Robert's relationship. It all kind of works together well, right? As Daenerys is pregnant and all these things, that's a huge concern for Robert and Ned. And I love the way Daenerys is processing all these things, where she's still reliant on Drogo, and we see what her actions kind of lead to, right? Where there's warfare. We see really the first look at warfare, and maybe not an actual battle, but the after effects of a war through Daenerys' eyes, as people are being taken into slavery, as people are being, sexually abused and all these things. And we see Daenerys blindly trusting the wrong people. We see her making mistakes because she's so young. And so Daenerys goes through this whole journey of trusting, Miri, and Drogo's pride getting in the way of him, and that lets him basically end up dying more or less. Well, vegetable then dying. And all of this kind of goes to this beautiful moment and tragic moment, but you understand Miri. She's not this just one-note villain. She's actually very understandable. And the way we understand the character, and, a lot of people look back on her and go, was she really a villain? Right? Daenerys is the protagonist of that arc, but Miri watched as all of her people were killed, sold into slavery, all these things. So you understand her development to where she's more of a morally gray character than she is just straight a villain. And so we're seeing these blood rituals and everything. Daenerys is slowly losing everything around her. She's losing her child, losing Drogo, having to kill him in a heartbreaking chapter. That is the speech about what life is. And then finally, the best chapter of the book, in my opinion, the last one, the dragons being reborn. It takes the character and it comes full circle. And I never thought that I would have Daenerys tied with Ned for being the best POV of this book. I never thought that going into this reread a year and 7 months ago. But I think there's a case. I personally don't have Daenerys as my number one, but I think there is a case for it. But I think Daenerys, from start to finish, was a fantastic POV. I think she had pretty much all of her chapters were at least in the middle or into the upper half of my rankings of the chapters. I don't think she had any that were even close to the bottom. And that's why she's up here at number 2. Number 1, I think it had to be obvious. And the only reason, this is how I rationalize putting Ned above Daenerys, is if you think about Ned, he has 15 chapters in book 1. Daenerys only has 10. So he kept this high of a rating while having 5 more chapters than Daenerys. If Daenerys had 5 more chapters, would she be as good as Ned? I don't think so. And so part of it is like Ned was just clearly the best POV of the book, just in terms of he had so many chapters, but yet all of them were so good. And I love Ned because, for one, he's in the most interesting plot line, right? He's in King's Landing. But the one thing I really like about this character is he's shrouded in mystery, right? We can tell from the character that there's stuff that just isn't being revealed to us, about Jon's mother, or, if his mother was Ashara or Lyanna, or who his actual father was. Was it Ned? Was it, Rhaegar? Who was, Jon's parents? And that's a big thing that shrouds Ned going through in this book. But Ned is someone that's already a developed POV, and I kind of hinted at this with Catelyn. And so all these other characters are kind of developing their morality, their sense of what they believe is good and right, and their morality and all that stuff, their ethics. Ned is someone that has all that stuff already. And so, so what you see with this character that might be different than other characters is taking a set ideology of what Ned believes he is as a person through his life experiences and all these things, and putting it through the ringer, putting Ned in a place where he doesn't really belong, in King's Landing, where he's in the complete opposite of what he believes everyone should be. He's out of his element. And that right away is a fantastic way to write the main character of the first book. But not only that, right, because you also have Ned being involved in this kind of murder mystery, right? Not only uncovering why Jon Arryn was killed, and was he killed by the Lannisters to begin with, but you also have to figure out, okay, well, how is that connected to then Bran's death, and what was Jon Arryn trying to find out, and this reveal that Jaime and Cersei are the parents, Jaime and Cersei are the parents of, these 3 kids, and so how that changes everything and puts everything into the right spot. Even though Ned doesn't figure it all out, a lot of it does kind of start to make sense now. Stannis being a Dragonstone, not being a court, because he knew these things, and he was the first one to figure it out. All this stuff kind of shifting into place. It's very compelling writing, right? All of his chapters are fantastic because they test Ned, right? They push Ned to his boundaries, right? He even gets to the point where he's forced to try and bribe the Gold Cloaks. That's not something Ned would do. And so he's pushed and he's pushed and he's pushed, right? It's starting off with, in one of his early chapters with, what does he do when he obviously knows Joffrey is lying about the attack that happened on him with Arya and Sansa and the Trident? Well, what does he do there, right? Obviously, he knows that Arya didn't actually try to kill him or any of these things, that Joffrey's a liar and all these things, but he's forced to kill a direwolf because he believes that that's for the better good of him trying to save his friend Robert and his brother. Robert, really, it's his brother, it's family to him. And all these things, he's putting his family through some quite awful things. And as it goes forward, and it turns, it keeps pushing him and pushing him. Does he allow for the council? Robert's wanting to kill Daenerys and her child. Ned doesn't allow those things. He doesn't want a child to be innocently killed, pushing him and pushing him more and more and more. And, trying to take kids in the middle of the night because that's the thing Renly wants to do because he believes that's the way to take a throne. But Ned won't do that either. And so it just keeps pushing Ned. It keeps pushing him and pushing him until finally at the very end of the book, when Ned's been trying to hold to his honor, his duty, and his ethics, he finally lets go of them to try and save his family. He puts family above his own pride or duty, and he admits to, trying to take the throne from Joffrey and that he's the true king, even though that's not the truth. That's not what Ned believes. He does it for his family and for the tragic reveal of it all to be that it didn't matter. Joffrey orders him to die all the same. And so the one time that Ned really gives in after being pushed and broken by King's Landing, he's killed. Ned is a fascinating character to me, and he is someone that's very well written in this first book. He takes that trope that I think so many people being introduced in this world, believed in terms of, okay, the main character, the hero of the story is not going to die. He's going to find his way out. And that doesn't happen. I know for me personally, Ned is the first time in my life, really, where I was introduced in a story where the hero didn't win. The hero lost because of his mistakes and because of the way he went about doing things. And it's not purely the first time, because I would say Revenge of the Sith was my first time where the actual heroes kind of lose, but it's a compelling way in which the story is crafted, because A Game of Thrones really is Ned's story. It's, you know, as much as it is about a lot of these other POVs and growing into their own characters, the first book is really Ned's story, is really what it is. But I hope you guys all enjoyed this ranking of the top 8 POVs of A Game of Thrones. Let me know what you guys think and where would you guys rate them. I think this is going to be very controversial because I think my people in my community just don't rate Daenerys very highly. I think this is Daenerys' best book. I think I've kind of gone back and forth between this book and Storm of Swords, and I think this book, Daenerys, is more of a complete character from start to finish than Storm of Swords. And she's more of, I think, of a focus in this book, right? She's more of a focus. And that's not to say, like, having more chapters is a good thing necessarily. A Dance Dragons, she has way more chapters than the first book, but she does not feel nearly as good as she does in the first book. But let me know what you guys think. Did I get it right? Did I get it wrong in your eyes? I think there's going to be a lot of different takes on this, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. I will be doing my full chapter rankings, probably in a video coming soon, but that's going to be a long one. It's going to take a while, so give me a little time on that one. But bye, guys.